Hi everyone, welcome to TTT, the Talking Transport Transformation podcast, brought to you by TUMI, the Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative. My name is Hannah, and today we are thrilled to have Sarayu as our guest. Sarayu is the founder of the Apathy Institute, a renowned think tank in India, working at the intersection of society, technology, and public policy. Her work focuses on issues such as digital inclusion, data governance, and leveraging technology to address societal challenges. With her expertise, she brings unique perspectives on how technology can be designed to be more equitable and effective, particularly in developing countries. In this episode, we will explore the influence of data and technology on mobility and public transport, a topic that bridges pressing challenges with innovative solutions. And with that, I hope you will enjoy the episode, and I head over to my colleague Freddie.
Hello, Sarayu, and welcome to our TUMI podcast, Talking Transport Transformation. Good to have you here.
Great to be here.
This episode's topic is about the influence of data technology on mobility and public transport. Shall we hop right in?
Yes, sounds great.
Okay, so worldwide we face enormous challenges in urban mobility. Cities are increasingly congested with motorized vehicles, and humans seem to feel almost alien in their own self-created habitats. At the same time, we aim to enable equitable participation in public life for all social groups while acting sustainably, an almost impossible task. And nevertheless, technology has often helped us simplify our lives and adapt more effectively to changing circumstances. You and the Apathy Institute work precisely at this intersection of society and technology. How do you see the role and necessity of digital solutions and data in promoting fairer and more sustainable mobility?
First of all, thank you very much, Frederick, for having me here. It's indeed a great topic to have a conversation about because it's one that has relevance to many countries across the world. Or rather, many cities, countries are grappling with this question of how to build sustainable mobility systems, and hence it's a challenge that's experienced worldwide. To my mind, I think intent to build a sustainable, equitable mobility system lies at the core of any effort. But there are a few considerations or a few things that can bring additional value to the question of sustainable mobility, particularly from the lens of digital technologies. So digital technologies can bring about accessibility and fairness because by providing personalized information, sometimes better sense of where there are gaps in the delivery of services, better ability to build about demand responsive transit, they can actually enhance accessibility. They can also improve resource allocation by providing optimal information at the right amount of time. It can also encourage sustainable practices. There is evidence from many parts of the world as to how data and digitized systems have actually enabled these sustainable practices, particularly through the provision of nudges, or in other instances, informing governments or leadership to be able to act better and more proactively. It can also bring about community inclusivity, and it can bring about safety and resilience. So all of these things are things that technologies in various forms can do. But of course, I know we've discussed this before, we have to treat this role of technology with quite a bit of caution, both because it might bring about inequity, but also because there are significant concerns around data protection and security. I'll pause here and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Yes, good point, and we will come back to that point later in our discussion. And to follow up on this question, in your opinion, what essential steps technologies need to be deployed to bring about such a transformation?
Thank you very much, Frederick, for that question. I think there are a few steps that we can consider in order to think about building essential technologies for better mobility systems. The first, of course, is better data gathering. I think a lot is said about collecting data or making data available, but I don't think we think enough about what these better systems are. So one, of course, is thinking about questions such as interoperability and shared data systems, because if data sets don't speak to each other, no actor involved in the ecosystem can actually make those better decisions. Thinking also about deploying better technologies making infrastructures available for collecting and processing this data is a significant first step. The second step goes to thinking about the human capability that sits around data. Because I think, again, and this is a topic that has been discussed quite significantly in the literature and in various conferences, but thinking both about the technological capabilities for data analysis being made widely available, which is that, going beyond the basics of data analysis into more capable software, tools, technologies which enable this analysis, because these are quite unequally distributed. So bigger technology companies have the ability to not just collect and harness data, they have the ability to analyze the data. So making the tools for analysis more equally available is one part of it. The second is again the capabilities. Because data analysis skills are very, rare to find, they're expensive. Thinking more deeply about how to actually make these skills more universally distributed or providing access to these training skills a little bit more is also another essential step in order to think about the role of digital technologies in the sustainable mobility transition. The third is, and I think we touched upon it in the first question, is for us to think a little bit more about principles for the system itself. So while these are not all technological solutions that we need to build, I think paying attention to principles of equity, privacy, fairness, readiness of the system, etc., is also important before we actually jump into designing these systems. So to summarize, I think first is paying attention to how we're collecting the data, how we are and analyzing it. So that's the first part. Second is thinking about capabilities around these systems or around data systems. And third is building a valuable set of principles that we all agree on. And of course, doing so in a participatory manner.
Of course, co-creation and participation is always a big thing we should always try to include. So we look at the mobility, and of course, the backbone is the public transportation, as it is intended to provide mobility for the entire population. So, however, not everyone has equal access, as also already mentioned, and inequalities are widespread. So which groups of people are particularly affected of these disparities?
Thank you very much for that question, and I think it's a very significant one. I think several groups of people experience difficulties from lack of access to sustainable, effective transportation in different parts of the world. So some of these follow the traditional structures of exclusion, which might be class, minority communities, etc. Women, for example, face significant disadvantages. But because of the nature of urban mobility and transportation, these inequalities can take on other forms. So people who live in the further away reaches of the city who need to come into the city are also disadvantaged in certain ways in terms of accessibility or the quality of service. So it's not just who we traditionally see as being disadvantaged. The second part of this question also comes into play when we think about how these disabilities operate, as well as the questions of intersectionality. By intersectionality, I mean that a certain individual or a group of individuals may have two disadvantages. They may be located further away from the city center, where typically work is done, and they may also be backward socioeconomic communities, and very many times these two occur together. Similarly, women are sometimes doubly disadvantaged. They might be from a socioeconomically backward community, as well as experience disadvantage pertaining particularly to questions of safety as women. So there is this question of intersectionality that also needs to be paid attention to in the context of sustainable urban mobility. We can't just stop with looking at who we recognize as disadvantaged and then operating on that basis. There are two, to my mind, and then smaller problems that come out of this question of exclusion. One is, of course, a service deficiency or a dark area in service where you don't think that people there might need transportation services at all. So it doesn't enter the planning process, and therefore you're leaving an area that is dark. Typically, it's also the area that's economically backward, sometimes with several members from racial minority groups or ethnic minority groups, again, compounding the lack of access to public transportation. The second is these public systems cause invisibility of certain kinds of mobility needs. So, for example, women do trip chaining, which is they'll go to the supermarket, then they'll go drop somebody off, then they'll do some healthcare, then they'll do some work, pick up the child back and, come back home. This kind of trip chaining is not often accounted for in public transportation systems. The other is that the elderly usually go off peak, but transportation systems are optimized for peak time management. So off time you don't have, or during the off peak hours you do not have enough options available, which disadvantages the elderly. And when you think about intersectionality in this lens, you realize how much disadvantage is created. So paying attention to not just new groups of disadvantaged individuals and how they might be experiencing the disadvantage, and then solving for it actively, I think these steps are critical in designing sustainable mobility systems.
I totally agree. But now, if we aim to use data as a solution to these inequalities and issues, we unfortunately encounter similar disparity once again. It is now widely recognized that current digital solutions and data collection exhibit a significant gap in mobility data, the so-called gender data gap, which primarily refers to the lack of data on women's mobility. For example, in India, the population is nearly evenly split, almost 50-50 between men and women, yet public transportation is often designed around the average 27-year-old man. At the same time, international studies, as you also mentioned, show that women take significantly more trips per day and use public transport more frequently. This gap also includes groups, leading to an underrepresentation of, for example, as you also said, so-called double disadvantaged individuals, who are part of society but are effectively ignored in data collection and public transport planning. How can digital solutions such as, for example, even AI or alternative data collection methods help create a more gender-responsive and inclusive transportation system?
Thank you for that question. I dare say up front that there is no radically different or unique idea that can make the development of technology more equitable. So I think that we need to start thinking about some of the old things that have worked and use them with great purpose and with great efficacy. But a few things to think about in the context of technology are first, equity first design. There is enough literature that talks about how very many systems, not just technical systems, are designed keeping in mind the average male. So, for example, the seat belt or is designed keeping in mind the male body, and it does not account for the structure of the average female body. And there are quite a few examples of this, and I don't want to go into this during this short discussion. But accounting for equity first design, or starting from the value system of saying, I want to account for as many sections of the population as possible, is very important. And here, the role of the state becomes very important in terms of saying or emphasizing the importance of such equity first design, particularly for public systems. So I think that needs to be paid attention to. The second is, I think, data sets. And again, there's quite a lot of discussion around the question of data sets and bias in data sets in the design of AI systems. So paying attention to how these biases creep in or in what ways biased data is collected is important. But in this specific question of bias, women experience this double disadvantage that you're speaking of. One is they face additional threats to safety and resilience. They also face particular characteristics in their use of urban mobility systems. And again, I talk about the average woman. There are, of course, women, I think, do have a fair amount of diversity in the ways in which they interact with systems, but not all of it is accounted for. The third is they also face a disadvantage in terms of, and this is again in some parts of the world, in terms of access to devices. So their data sometimes is not even getting onto the radar, like it's not even a blip on the radar because their devices are shared. They're not necessarily smartphone users in some instances. Their use is curtailed by typically an older male within the family, depending on the nature of the society. So here you have 3 or 4 layers of disadvantage, which again, if you talk about equity first systems, they need to solve for some of these factual issues. And there are many solutions. And I know I spent a lot of time highlighting the problem, but there are many solutions. One way is to think about more active processes of community participation to gather data from those that are disadvantaged. Thinking also about heuristics in data. Are there other ways or other indicators that don't rely on personal data sharing being a part of the equation in data gathering? So thinking of these substitutes and heuristics can also be a very effective mechanism. But most important, and I said this in the earlier part of the recording, is the intent to build such a system. And that can be, I think, drive a lot of the conscious action towards building inclusivity and accessibility within these systems.
That's a good point. And also, to protect this community, you also need to protect their data. And to get into the work of the UPT Institute is, of course, you also advocate for data governance. Mobility offerings outside of public transport have developed significantly in recent years. Alternative mobility options, especially sharing models, have now become well established, and digital platforms provide an easy means to collect data. However, data security concerns must not be overlooked with digital platforms. As you already mentioned in the beginning, while such organizations collect valuable data, it is often unclear where the data is stored, with whom it is shared, or how it is ultimately used. You and the UPT Institute are dedicated to data governance to ensure that data is shared safely and equitably while respecting people's privacy rights. In your opinion, what approaches and principles are crucial to managing mobility data in a way that both protects privacy and serves the public good?
Thank you for that question. I think this is something that's very significant in terms of building sustainable mobility systems. And I know we talked about it in the earlier part of the discussion as well, in terms of sometimes the conflicts between different kinds of interests that emerge in the context of developing technology. Again, with respect to mobility, I don't think there is anything unique in terms of the principles or in terms of the practices that need to be brought about. So building privacy by design systems or putting privacy first as a part of the design process is itself critical. I think there are a few other considerations to keep in mind. I think very often in conversations pertaining to innovation, I know this is something that we often hear in India, and I don't know if it's the case in other parts of the world, particularly Germany where you work, but there is a trap or a innovation versus privacy framing where it appears that in order to be attentive to principles of data governance, you are somehow compromising on innovation. And what essentially happens is that you don't ask even the question of how do you actually build within a framework of respectful, community rights minded data governance practices. So it's presented as a trade-off, and at least I've seen very many debates where one is posited against the other, and it seemed like a war. And by arguing for one side, you're kind of taking away from the other. I think that mindset and shifting that mindset is important in order to ask ourselves, now with all of these safeguards, how do we build safely? I think there are two other pillars that need to be addressed in order to think about this question of data governance a little bit more effectively. I think one is the role of private corporations and how do you incentivize them? And because there is a hesitancy to share data, I think there are both concerns that they have. I mean, particularly around IP is the standard argument that is made. And while there have been instances of few companies very progressively putting out data as a part of sharing mandates or whatever else, I think thinking a little bit more about what are the non-obvious incentives as well as potential mandates in terms of some parts of data being open is very important. I think careful consideration of this issue is the first part. The second part is the mechanisms by which states can actually get access to this data or mandate the sharing of this data. I will tread carefully here because this is a very thorny issue. But thinking about other mechanisms to encourage data sharing by companies, including, for example, public-private partnerships, which are essentially relations, formalized contractual relations between the state and the private party, often used in infrastructure, may offer some instructive ways for us to do this more effectively. I'll pause here, but hope to pick up some of these threads in the rest of the discussion as well.
That is a good point. And these companies, they collect huge amounts of data, and this necessitates and improved protection and secure management to prevent these companies from using loopholes or circumventing regulations, similar to what we see in other sectors to maximize their profits. In the paper Principles for Revenue Models of Data Stewardships, your colleagues Aditi Ramesh and Asta Kapoor argue in favor of so-called data stewards. If I understand correctly, and please correct me if I'm mistaken, data stewards act as third parties who negotiate on behalf of users to enhance data security and are funded similarly to a union through a fee-to-entity model. Ideally, they could even receive legal recognition similar to investment advisors or trust ports in Scotland. So how exactly are the roles of a data steward defined? Do they act somewhat like a library that collects data from companies and controls its secure and abuse-free public use?
Thank you. That's a very significantly important issue to talk about. I think what we know and what the weight of the literature suggests is that individuals and communities are often willing to put their trust in a variety of third parties in order to navigate their rights more securely with the state or with other private entities, and hence the role of a data steward becomes very significant. Just a caution is that the role of the steward, at least in the ways we imagine it, there are sort of different models, and I'll come to talking about those. But the role of stewards goes beyond the bare bones or the basics of the framework of data sharing. While they're not in some instances, and within the trust model, of course, there's a fiduciary role that they play. But in general, it is positively and proactively thinking about data sharing, sometimes going beyond the norms and negotiating actively for the communities that they represent, which a general entity that is sharing is not negotiating for you or taking your side in a certain way. So that proactive, positive role that stewards play is what at least we imagine distinguishes the role of the steward. Now, there are 2 points to consider within the question of stewardship itself, which is who plays the role of the steward and what are the models of which are instantiations of it. The role can be played by multiple entities. It could be an individual, it could be a civil society organization. It could also be a technology-based steward. So India has what is known as the account aggregator, which is a way for you to share data. Typically, and this is the early implementation seem to be in financial services, but essentially you would share your data with somebody like a bank who would be able to use that to give you a loan, for example. And this is atomized, revocable consent. So it is a technology-based steward that some would hesitate to call it a steward, but it's essentially a technology-based mechanism that allows you to share your data. So it can be played by a variety of individuals or entities. That some which already have the trust of the system, some which have to build up trust from the beginning. Then there are different models or principles that can instantiate it. So you can have a trust model, which is fairly specifically interpreted in different kinds of law. So the civil law jurisdictions have a different or slightly different interpretation than the common law jurisdictions. So there are ways. So trust is one model of stewardship. The other model of stewardship could be cooperatives, where you act within a cooperative framework in order to share data, and the principles of a cooperative would apply. So there are sort of multiple instantiations of the question of stewardship itself. And so in some ways, the puzzle is what works best in a particular context, what are the costs of building trust within a system, and then how do you ensure that once that trust is there, it is continued to be maintained. Of course, there's a lot of literature, a lot of scholars, including at APTI, we spend a lot of time thinking about this question, but it might be one of the most productive ways for us to think about this data sharing, community participation question in mobility, and I think in other domains as well.
I totally agree to the data stewards, and I find it a promising solution for reducing the opacity in data usage and strengthening the protection against misuse. So, Sarayu, thank you very much for your time and knowledge. It was a pleasure talking to you. And do you have any last message you want to send?
Just 2 words, intent and practice. I think with both of those, we can definitely design better and more inclusive technological systems. We need to have our hearts in the right place and practice having our hearts in our right place through better participatory, accountable, transparent mechanisms.
Perfect. I think those are good words to end the episode. So take care and see or hear you soon.
Thank you. See you soon.
Thank you very much to our guest Sarayu for joining us today, and for her continued dedication to fostering equitable mobility and responsible data practices through her work. Wishing you a wonderful day ahead, and may you continue to advocate for sustainable mobility systems for all. See you next time.